All right, welcome to The Explainer. Today we're diving into something that can absolutely poison a company from the inside out, the toxic worker. We've all heard the horror stories. Maybe we've even lived them. But what's the real cost? And how in the world do these people seem to get away with it, sometimes even getting promoted? Let's get into it.
So, let's start with the big mystery, right? It's a question that honestly feels completely backwards, but it really gets to the core of this whole problem. How can someone who causes so much chaos not only keep their job, but actually climb the ladder? It just doesn't make sense. To figure this out, we first have to be really clear on what we mean by toxic.
Okay, so first things first, we've got to get specific. What actually makes a leader toxic? Because, it's more than just being a demanding or a bad boss. We're talking about a really specific and super destructive pattern of behavior.
And it's interesting. One of the sharpest definitions actually comes from a place you might not expect, the U.S. Army. They define it as this combination of self-centered attitudes and behaviors that straight up hurts their subordinates, the organization, and even the mission itself. So this isn't just about someone who's bad at managing people. It's a deliberate style that can tear down the whole operation.
And what does that look like in the real world? Well, it's not some abstract concept. We're talking about things like bullying, playing favorites, always withholding information, or using fear to get things done. It's constant gossiping and finger-pointing. A lot of this probably sounds familiar, right? These are those day-to-day things that build a culture of fear and make it pretty much impossible for a team to actually do good work.
Now, when this kind of behavior gets really bad, it actually crosses a legal line. The U.S. Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, that's the EEOC, has a specific term for it: a hostile work environment. And that's when harassment gets so severe or happens so often that any reasonable person would find it abusive. So we're not just talking about bad vibes here. This is a straight-up violation of federal law.
Okay, so this brings us right back to that big puzzle we started with. If these people are so destructive, how on earth do they keep getting ahead? Well, the answer is complicated. It's something called the performance paradox.
The book Snakes in Suits gives us a really important clue here. It says these individuals, who are sometimes called corporate psychopaths, are absolute masters of manipulation. They have this talent for reading people, for sizing them up in an instant. But they're not doing it to connect with you. No, they're looking for your weak spots, your vulnerabilities, trying to figure out how they can use you.
And it's not random. They literally follow a playbook. Step 1, they use their charm to get in the door. Step 2, they assess everybody, sizing them up as either pawns they can manipulate or patrons who can help them move up. Then comes the manipulation, spreading gossip, false information. Step 4 is confrontation, where they basically assassinate the character of anyone who poses a threat. And finally, ascension. They take power, often from the very people who supported them on their way up. But here is the absolute twist, and it's a big one. You'd think all this destructive behavior, the deception, the bullying, would just tank their performance, right? Wrong. A major study from Harvard Business School found the exact opposite. A lot of the time, these toxic employees are actually more productive. They're faster, they produce more work than their colleagues, and because they get results, it becomes incredibly hard for a company to justify getting rid of them.
But that productivity comes at a huge hidden cost. So even though their output might look good on paper, the damage they're doing under the surface is massive. And what's really fascinating, what the research shows us, is that we can actually put a dollar amount on that damage.
Get this. According to that same Harvard study, just one toxic worker costs a company almost $12,500. And that's just in turnover costs, meaning that's the price of replacing all the good employees who quit because they can't stand working with that person. That number doesn't even begin to cover things like legal fees, other compliance risks, or the complete destruction of team morale.
And just look at this comparison. It really puts it into perspective. So a company gets about $5,000 in value from hiring a top 1% superstar employee. That's great. But look at the other side. They save more than double that, over $12,000, just by avoiding a toxic hire. The lesson here is so clear. It's actually more profitable to avoid the bad apple than it is to hire a rock star.
And it gets worse, because the damage spreads. The data from Harvard shows that this toxicity is, and I mean this literally, contagious. If you're exposed to a toxic colleague, your own chances of becoming toxic yourself go up by nearly 50%. It's the spillover effect that can infect a whole team. You know the saying, one bad apple really can spoil the whole barrel.
And this isn't just an HR problem or a single company's issue. When these kinds of people manage to climb all the way to the top, their behavior can have consequences that ripple out across the entire economy. It actually becomes a systemic risk.
So, who's actually making it to the top? Well, check out this stat. Research shows that while about 1% of the general population has psychopathic traits, that number jumps to 3%. It triples when you look at senior executives. It kind of suggests that our corporate systems might be accidentally rewarding and promoting these exact personalities. And the potential for damage here it's just massive. I mean, some researchers have even linked the kind of corporate culture that led up to the 2008 financial crisis to these exact traits. And in the wake of that crisis, regulators started noticing this really troubling pattern, which led to a whole new wave of regulations designed to hold individuals accountable, not just the company as a whole.
Yeah, this pattern even has a name. They call it rolling bad apples. It's exactly what it sounds like. It's when someone who causes a ton of problems at one company just quietly resigns and rolls on over to another firm, and their new employer has no idea about their past behavior. It basically lets them bounce from job to job, leaving a trail of damage across the entire industry.
So, after all that, what can actually be done about this? Well, the good news is people are fighting back, and it's happening on a few different fronts. The new keyword is accountability.
The response is really a three-pronged attack. First, you have individuals who are learning how to cope, whether that's speaking up or just knowing when to leave. Then you have the companies themselves, which are starting to get smarter about screening for more than just productivity in the hiring process. And finally, and this is a big one, you have regulators creating entirely new systems to make sure accountability starts at the very, very top. So let's take a closer look at how these new rules actually work. In places like the UK and Australia, they've put these frameworks in place called individual accountability regimes. First, they use something called responsibility mapping to make it crystal clear who is responsible for what. No more hiding in the gray areas. Second, they have what's called a reasonable steps duty, which means executives have to prove they took action to prevent problems. They can't just say, I didn't know. And third, they're finally tackling those rolling bad apples by making detailed reference checks mandatory.
So this visual from the Financial Stability Institute kind of shows how this new approach works. Now, it looks a little complex, so let's break it down. They call it the accountability stack, and you can basically think of it as layers of defense. At the very bottom, you have the baseline duties everyone has. In the middle layer, you've got protections for people like whistleblowers, and then at the top you have these really powerful new rules aimed squarely at senior executives. The whole point of stacking it like this is simple: to make sure that when something goes wrong, there are real consequences for the actual people responsible.
And that brings us to the big final question, doesn't it? These new rules are definitely a huge step forward. They make it much harder for toxic leaders to just hide behind vague group decisions. But is it actually enough? Is it enough to detox the modern workplace and change the cultures that let these people get ahead in the first place? Well, that's the billion-dollar question, and that's the challenge that's still ahead of us.